What if the oldest stories humanity ever told were not stories at all? What if they were warnings encoded in the only medium that could outlast everything else? A human voice passed from one generation to the next, across tens of thousands of years, carrying a message so important that it could not be allowed to die, even when the world it described had long since vanished beneath the waves. There is a pattern buried inside the oldest memories our species has kept. Not a metaphor, not a symbol, not a convenient myth assembled to explain the inexplicable. A pattern that shows up in the oral traditions of Aboriginal Australians whose cultural memory stretches back 60,000 years, in the clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia, in the sacred texts of the Hebrews and the Hindus, in the winter mythology of the Norse, in the prophecies of the Hopi, in the surviving fragments of the Maya. More than 500 flood narratives have been documented across every inhabited continent on Earth. 500 cultures that never traded, never met, never shared a single syllable of language, all remember the same thing. A time when the water rose, a time when the world was wiped clean, a time when almost everything that had been built, almost everything that had been known, sank beneath the surface and was lost. And here is where the question opens, slowly, like a door in a room you thought you knew. If the oldest stories on Earth are not myths, but memories, if they are data encoded in the only format that could survive the collapse of civilizations, what exactly are they remembering? And more importantly, what does it mean for us, sitting here in the quiet hours, on the other side of all that forgetting, in a world that has been built on foundations we no longer fully understand? That question will carry us through tonight. Hold it gently. Let it rest somewhere at the back of your mind as we move through the evidence, through the ice and the stone and the ocean floor and the ancient clay, through the drowned coastlines and the buried temples and the traditions that refuse to die no matter how many thousands of years press down upon them. We will not rush. There is no hurry here. The past has been waiting patiently, and it can wait a little longer while we approach it with the care it deserves. Let your breathing slow. Let the noise of the day begin to release its hold on your shoulders. If you're lying in the dark, let the darkness be comfortable. You are in the archive now. The night shift has begun. Before we go further into the deep past, if this kind of quiet journey through evidence and ancient memory resonates with you, consider subscribing to the channel. These explorations take time to assemble, and knowing that someone is listening makes the long hours in the archive worthwhile. And if you are settling in somewhere tonight, in whatever corner of the world you occupy, leave a note in the comments telling me where you are and what time it is. There is something genuinely moving about knowing that these stories are traveling across time zones, that someone in Auckland and someone in Oslo and someone in Sao Paulo are all drifting through the same ancient mystery. At different hours of the same night, beneath different constellations, united by the same quiet curiosity. Now let us go back, not centuries, millennia. Picture the world as it was 60,000 years ago. The continent we now call Australia has been inhabited for perhaps as long as that, the exact timeline still being refined by researchers working at the edge of what dating technology can tell us. But the range is extraordinary by any measure. 60,000 years of continuous cultural presence. 60,000 years of language, story, ceremony, and accumulated knowledge pass from one generation to the next without interruption. To put that in perspective, the entire span of recorded history, from the first Sumerian writing tablets to the present moment, covers roughly 5,000 years. The Aboriginal Australian oral tradition is 12 times older than writing itself. And within that tradition, preserved across those unimaginable depths of time, are stories about the sea. Specifically, stories about coastlines that no longer exist. Researchers studying Aboriginal oral traditions along the southern and southeastern coasts of Australia have documented narratives that describe specific geographical features, bays, islands, river mouths, and landmarks that were submerged when sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. These are not vague allegorical references to water and transformation. These are precise geographic memories. One tradition from the Naranga people of the York Peninsula describes the time when the Spencer Gulf, a large body of water that today reaches 80 kilometers inland, was dry land. Another tradition from the Gunditj Mara people of southwestern Victoria describes the formation of volcanic features in their landscape in terms that match geological evidence for eruptions that occurred between 30 and 40,000 years ago. Stories from communities along the Eyre Peninsula describe islands that once existed in what is now open sea. Islands that can be identified on maps of the submerged continental shelf. Islands that disappeared beneath the waves roughly 10,000 years ago, when sea levels reached their current position. When geologists and oceanographers map the ancient coastline of Australia as it would have appeared during the last ice age, when sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today, the features described in these oral traditions appear. Not approximately, not roughly. They appear where the stories say they should be. This is not coincidence. This is memory. The question that researchers like Dr. Foster Patrick Nunn and Dr. Nicholas Reed have been exploring is not whether these traditions preserve genuine geographic information. The evidence for that is now compelling enough to have been published in peer-reviewed journals and accepted by a growing body of scholars. The question is what this tells us about the capacity of oral tradition to function as a reliable archive across timescales that dwarf anything the written record has managed to preserve. Think about what is implied here. For 10,000 years, through countless generations of parents and children, through droughts and migrations and cultural transformations, we cannot even begin to reconstruct. A community maintained an accurate description of a coastline that no living person had ever seen. Not because they had photographs or maps or written records, because the story was considered important enough to preserve exactly, because the tradition of transmission was rigorous enough to prevent the kind of drift and distortion that we might expect over such an enormous span of time. Because whoever first encoded that memory understood that the information it contained was worth protecting across the generations. The implication is staggering. If oral traditions can preserve accurate geographic information for 10,000 years, what else might they be preserving? What other data might be encoded in the stories we have too easily dismissed as myth? Consider the mechanisms by which this preservation was achieved. The Aboriginal traditions were not simply stories told casually around a fire, subject to the whims of individual memory and the natural drift of retelling. They were embedded in ceremony, in song, in the elaborate system of knowledge transmission known as the song lines, pathways across the landscape that connected sacred sites and encoded navigational, ecological, and historical information in a form that could be walked, sung, and danced as well as spoken. The information was distributed across multiple carriers, multiple performers, multiple ceremonial contexts, so that no single failure of memory could erase it. The redundancy was built in. The architecture of the tradition was designed, consciously or otherwise, to resist forgetting. This is a form of information engineering. It is not primitive. It is sophisticated in ways that our own information systems are only beginning to approach. Modern archivists and information theorists speak of redundancy, of distributed storage, of encoding information in multiple formats to ensure survival against any single point of failure. The Aboriginal Australians were doing precisely this, not with servers and backup drives, but with human bodies and human voices, and the rhythms of ceremony repeated across generations without interruption. The result was an archive that outlasted every writing system, every library, every digital storage format that has ever been invented, by a margin of tens of thousands of years. If this question is pulling at something in you, I would gently ask you to like this video and subscribe to the channel so these late-night journeys through the archive can keep finding their way to you. Let us sit with that question for a moment before we move further into the evidence. The flooding of those Australian coastlines was not a sudden catastrophe, at least not in the most dramatic sense. The sea level rise that accompanied the end of the last ice age was a gradual process measured in centuries and millennia. The slow melting of vast ice sheets releasing water back into the world's oceans at a pace that was imperceptible from year to year, but transformative across generations. A village on the coast might find the tide a little higher each decade. The fishing grounds might shift. The landmarks that grandparents remembered might gradually disappear beneath the waves. Over a lifetime, the change might be noticeable, but not catastrophic. Over 10 lifetimes, it would be profound. But there were moments within that long, slow transformation when the change was not gradual at all. There were pulses. The scientific term is meltwater pulse, and the most dramatic of these documented events is known as Meltwater Pulse 1A, a period roughly 14,600 years ago when sea levels rose by somewhere between 16 and 25 meters in a period of perhaps 500 years. That is an average rise of 3 to 5 centimeters per year, which does not sound dramatic until you consider what it means for low-lying coastal communities. It means that within a single human lifetime, the coastline could retreat by hundreds of meters. It means that land which was dry and inhabited when a person was born might be underwater by the time they died. It means that the transformation was not something that could be comfortably absorbed into the background of daily life. It was visible. It was ongoing. It was, by any reasonable measure, the defining experience of those generations. Imagine standing at the edge of the water as a child and watching it advance, year by year, swallowing the ground where you used to play, covering the roots of trees your grandparents planted, reaching toward the higher ground where your community has retreated. Imagine the conversations around the fire at night, the elders describing how much further inland the sea was when they were young, the children asking where the water will stop, the silence that follows because no one knows the answer. This was not an abstract environmental concern. This was the lived experience of real communities watching their world transform beneath their feet. The urgency to encode that experience, to ensure that the children and the grandchildren and the generations beyond would know what had happened and what it looked like when the water came, would have been immediate and profound. And there was another event, more dramatic still, that occurred not during the slow warming, but as an interruption to it. Roughly 12,900 years ago, something happened that stopped the warming in its tracks. In a matter of decades, possibly even years, temperatures in parts of the northern hemisphere plummeted by as much as 10 degrees Celsius. The glaciers that had been retreating stabilized or advanced again. Rivers froze, forests died back. The animals that had ventured northward into newly greening territories found themselves caught in a tightening noose of cold. The warming that had been underway for thousands of years simply stopped. This was the younger Dryas, named with a certain quiet poetry after a small white wildflower, Dryas octopetala, that thrives in Arctic conditions and whose pollen suddenly reappeared in European lake sediments at precisely this moment in the geological record. It lasted approximately 1,200 years, from roughly 12,900 years ago to about 11,700 years ago. And then, just as abruptly as it had begun, it ended. The world warmed again, faster this time, and the ice retreated for good. The evidence for the younger Dryas is not speculative. It is one of the most thoroughly documented climate events in Earth's history, confirmed by multiple independent archives, each one a different kind of memory that the planet itself keeps. Greenland ice cores drilled from kilometers deep within the ice sheet show a sharp drop in oxygen isotope ratios at the onset of this cold period. These cores are extraordinary archives. Each layer of compressed snowfall traps tiny bubbles of ancient atmosphere, dust particles from distant volcanoes, pollen from vanished forests, even traces of cosmic debris that filters down through the upper atmosphere. By counting and analyzing these layers, scientists can reconstruct the climate of any given year going back hundreds of thousands of years with a resolution that approaches the annual. The ice does not editorialize. It does not simplify. It records everything that fell from the sky and everything that rose from the earth and everything that drifted on the wind, layer upon layer, year upon year, a chronicle of unimaginable patience and completeness. Antarctic ice cores reveal complementary patterns, a phenomenon scientists call the bipolar seesaw. When the north cooled, the south warmed. This is not coincidence, but a consequence of how heat is distributed by ocean circulation. When the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the great conveyor belt of ocean heat that keeps northern Europe habitable, weakens or shuts down, the heat that would normally be transported northward remains trapped in the southern hemisphere, warming the Antarctic while the Arctic freezes. The younger Dryas was not a local anomaly. It was a reorganization of the entire global climate system. Lake sediments from sites as distant as Japan and Germany preserve the signal. At Lake Suigetsu in Japan, annually laminated sediments, called varves, layers so fine and regular that they can be counted like tree rings, record the younger Dryas' onset and termination with remarkable precision. The beauty of VARV records is that they provide an independent clock. Unlike radiocarbon dating, which must be calibrated against other records, VARVs simply count the years, one layer per season, laid down in the still waters of a lake bottom. The Suigetsu chronology is so precise that it has been incorporated into the International Radiocarbon Calibration Dataset, the standard against which radiocarbon dates around the world are now measured. Speleothems, the mineral formations that grow inside caves when groundwater deposits calcium carbonate over thousands of years, provide yet another independent archive. The oxygen isotope ratios trapped in these mineral layers reflect temperature and rainfall conditions at the time of deposition, and uranium-thorium dating can pin their ages with uncertainties as small as a few decades, even for samples tens of thousands of years old. Caves in northern Spain, in the British uplands, in the Dolomites, all record the same event in their own silent language of mineral chemistry. Together, these independent archives create an interlocking chronology of extraordinary precision. They confirm the same story from different materials, different locations, different scientific methods. Something dramatic happened to Earth's climate nearly 13,000 years ago. And then it happened again, in reverse, roughly 1,200 years later. The transition out of the younger Dryas was, if anything, even more abrupt than its onset. Ice core data suggests that temperatures in Greenland rose by as much as 10 degrees Celsius in a single decade. A single decade. That is not geological time, that is a human lifetime. The generation that shivered through the final years of the younger Dryas cold could have lived to see a world that was unrecognizably warmer. Now, imagine being alive during this. Imagine your grandparents telling stories of how the world was warming, how the great herds were moving north, how the rivers ran full and the fish were plentiful, and then watching the cold return, relentlessly, year after year, pushing the animals south, freezing the rivers, burying the landscape under snow that did not melt come spring. And then imagine, if you lived long enough, watching the warmth return with a suddenness that must have seemed almost violent after 1,200 years of cold. This was not an abstraction for the people who lived through it. This was their world ending. And then, improbably, beginning again. The younger Dryas coincided with the extinction of more than 35 genera of large mammals in North America alone. Mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, American horses, camels, the short-faced bear standing taller than any modern bear, all gone within a geological heartbeat. The Clovis culture, one of the earliest well-documented human cultures in the Americas, characterized by their beautifully crafted fluted stone spear points, disappeared from the archaeological record at precisely this boundary. Something ended their way of life so completely that the distinctive technology they had developed over centuries simply ceased to appear in the ground. Before the younger Dryas, Ice Age North America was teeming with life on a scale that is difficult to comprehend today. Herds of woolly mammoths, some standing 4 meters tall at the shoulder, moved across the tundra in groups of dozens or hundreds, their great curved tusks catching the low Arctic light. Mastodons, smaller and stockier than their mammoth cousins, browsed in the spruce forests of the eastern woodlands. Saber-toothed cats with canine teeth nearly 18 centimeters long stalked prey through the grasslands. Giant ground sloths, some weighing more than 4 tons, lumbered through the forest like living boulders. Short-faced bears claimed the open plains. American horses, not yet extinct, galloped in herds that would have rivaled the buffalo. Camels, dire wolves, giant beavers the size of black bears, glyptodonts, armored cousins of the armadillo large enough to shelter a crouching human beneath their shells. Among these animals moved the Clovis people. Their distinctive stone spear points, found across nearly all of North America from coast to coast, suggest either a remarkably mobile population or the rapid spread of a highly effective technology. The craft involved in making a Clovis point is extraordinary. The flint knapper had to select the right stone, often travelling considerable distances to obtain high-quality chert or obsidian. The stone was prepared, and then a long channel flake was removed from the base in a single controlled strike. A technique so difficult that it takes modern practitioners years to master. These were not simple people making simple tools. These were artisans working at the edge of what stone technology could achieve. And then they vanished, along with the animals they hunted, along with a way of life that had been developing for thousands of years. What happened? The debate is not fully resolved, and it is worth sitting with that uncertainty rather than rushing past it. The two dominant explanations that researchers have proposed are climate change and human overhunting, and the evidence supports both to varying degrees. But in the last 2 decades, a third hypothesis has entered the discussion, one that is still contested but that has accumulated enough evidence to demand serious consideration. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that the onset of the Younger Dryas cooling was triggered, at least in part, by the impact or airburst of a fragmented comet or asteroid over the Laurentide ice sheet, the vast glacier that covered most of North America during the last ice age. The hypothesis was first formally published in 2007 by a team of researchers led by James Kennett and Richard Firestone, and it has been generating scientific controversy ever since. The evidence they and subsequent researchers have pointed to includes a thin layer of sediment found at sites across North America, Europe, and the Middle East that appears to mark the Younger Dryas boundary. This layer contains elevated concentrations of certain materials, platinum group elements, nanodiamonds, spherules of glass and metal, and a form of carbon called Lonsdaleite that some researchers associate with cosmic impacts. It also contains what appears to be evidence of widespread burning, charred biomass, soot, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, concentrations that suggest fires of enormous scale. The sites where this layer has been identified include some of the most archaeologically significant locations in North America. Abu Huraira in Syria, one of the earliest known agricultural settlements, shows evidence of intense burning at the Younger Dryas boundary. The black mat, a dark organic layer found at multiple Clovis sites across North America, appears directly above the last Clovis artifacts and below the Younger Dryas boundary sediments, as if whatever happened at that moment simply ended the Clovis world. The hypothesis remains controversial. Other researchers have challenged the identification of some of the proposed impact markers, arguing that the nanodiamonds and spherules can form through non-impact processes, that the platinum concentrations are not anomalous enough to require a cosmic explanation. that the evidence for synchronous burning across multiple continents is not as robust as the hypothesis requires. The scientific debate is ongoing, and it would be dishonest to present the impact hypothesis as established fact. But here is what is established. Something ended the younger Dryas. Something began it. The climate system reorganized with a speed that challenges our assumptions about how gradually the world changes. And the communities that lived through it, on multiple continents, across cultures that had no contact with each other, appear to have encoded the memory of what happened in the stories they told their children. Because this is where the oral traditions become impossible to ignore. The stories are not vague, they are specific. They describe the sky burning, the earth shaking, great floods following great fires, the death of the animals, the end of a previous world and the beginning of a new one. The Hopi tradition speaks of 3 previous worlds, each destroyed in turn, the first by fire, the second by ice, the third by flood, before the emergence into the current 4th world. The Norse Eddas describe Fimbul winter, 3 consecutive winters without summer, preceding the great catastrophe of Ragnarok, a period of cosmic violence that destroys the old world and from which a new one emerges. The Hindu Puranas describe 4 great ages, the Yugas, each ending in destruction before the cycle begins again. The Aztec tradition describes 5 suns, 5 previous worlds, each destroyed by a different catastrophe. The 4th ending in a great flood, the 5th, our current world, described as perpetually threatened by the same fate. 500 flood narratives across every inhabited continent, in cultures that never met. We keep expecting these to be coincidences. They keep refusing to be. And there is a detail worth pausing on here, a detail that is easy to pass over if you are moving too quickly through the evidence. The flood narratives are not simply about water. They are about what comes before the water and what comes after it. The fire that precedes the flood, the darkness that follows, the single survivor or small group of survivors who carry the seeds of the next world through the catastrophe, the covenant or the promise or the instruction that the survivors receive about how to live differently in the world that comes after. These are not random story elements. They are a consistent structure, a template that appears with remarkable fidelity across cultures separated by oceans and millennia. The structure itself is data. The consistency of the structure across independent traditions is evidence that the traditions are not independently invented, but independently remembered. I am curious what you make of this. If a pattern this consistent appears across 500 independent traditions, what do you think it is that humanity was trying so hard not to forget? Leave your thoughts in the comments. This is exactly the kind of question the archive benefits from having many minds turn over together. Now let us travel to a site that should not exist, or rather, a site that forces us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about when human civilization began. In southeastern Turkey, on a limestone ridge overlooking the plains of the Harran, there is an archaeological site called Göbekli Tepe. The name means pot-belly hill in Turkish, a prosaic name for what may be the most significant archaeological discovery of the 20th century. It was first surveyed by a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt in 1994, and what he found there has been quietly rewriting the textbooks ever since. Göbekli Tepe consists of a series of circular enclosures each containing massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some of them standing more than 5 meters tall and weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in precise patterns and covered with elaborate carvings. The carvings depict animals, foxes, snakes, vultures, scorpions, wild boars, lions, and various geometric symbols, executed with a skill and consistency that speaks to a sophisticated artistic tradition. The central pillars in each enclosure are often carved with what appear to be human arms along their sides, suggesting that they were intended to represent stylized human figures, possibly ancestors, possibly deities, possibly something that our conceptual vocabulary does not have a clean word for. The site has been radiocarbon dated to approximately 12,000 years ago. The oldest layers may be even older. This places Göbekli Tepe at or just after the end of the Younger Dryas, at the very moment when the world was warming again after 1,200 years of cold. And here is what makes this extraordinary. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were, according to the archaeological evidence, hunter-gatherers. They had no agriculture, no pottery, no metal tools, no permanent settlements in the conventional sense. They were, by the standard narrative of human development, thousands of years away from being capable of organizing the labor, planning, and architectural knowledge required to build what they built. The standard narrative of human development goes something like this. Humans were hunter-gatherers for most of their existence, living in small mobile bands, surviving on what the land provided, incapable of the sustained cooperation required for large-scale construction. Then, roughly 10,000 years ago, agriculture was invented. Farming allowed surplus food. Surplus food allowed some people to be freed from food production. Freed people could specialize. Specialization led to craft. Craft led to trade. Trade led to towns. Towns led to cities. Cities led to writing. Writing led to civilization. The whole story is presented as a sequence, a ladder, one rung following inevitably from the previous. Göbekli Tepe breaks the ladder. Here is a site that required the organized labor of hundreds of people, sustained over decades, to quarry enormous limestone blocks from bedrock using stone tools, transport them to the ridge, shape them with precision, erect them in carefully planned arrangements, and carve them with complex iconographic programs that remained consistent across multiple construction phases. This is not the work of a small band of wanderers. This is the work of a community with leadership, planning, shared purpose, and accumulated knowledge. It is, by any reasonable definition, the work of a civilization, and yet the people who built it were hunter-gatherers. The implication that some researchers have drawn from this is not that the standard narrative is entirely wrong, but that it may have the causation reversed. Perhaps agriculture did not create civilization. Perhaps civilization, or something like it, created agriculture. Perhaps the organizational complexity required to build Göbekli Tepe came first, and the cultivation of wild grasses in the surrounding region, which is documented in the archaeological record of this period, came as a consequence of having large numbers of people gathered in one place who needed to be fed. This is not a fringe idea. It is a hypothesis taken seriously by mainstream archaeologists, including some who have worked directly at the site. But it has implications that reach further than the origins of farming. If the organizational capacity for large-scale construction predates agriculture, then the entire timeline of human social complexity needs to be reconsidered. And if it needs to be reconsidered at 12,000 years ago, what might we be missing at 15,000 years ago, or 20,000, or further still? There is a further dimension to Göbekli Tepe that the carvings themselves suggest, one that researchers are still working to fully interpret. The animal imagery is not random. Certain species appear with striking frequency and in configurations that suggest deliberate symbolic intent. Vultures, which in many ancient traditions are associated with the passage between life and death, appear prominently, sometimes depicted carrying what appear to be human heads. Scorpions, associated in Mesopotamian tradition with the guardians of the underworld and the passage of the sun through the night sky, appear in multiple enclosures. Snakes, perhaps the most universally symbolic animal in the human repertoire, win their way across pillar after pillar. The foxes, which appear more frequently than any other animal, may have held a specific mythological significance that we have not yet recovered. What is clear is that the builders of Göbekli Tepe were not simply decorating their architecture. They were encoding something, a cosmology, a mythology, a set of relationships between the human and the non-human world that mattered enough to be carved in stone and maintained across multiple generations of construction. There is another detail about Göbekli Tepe that deserves careful attention. Sometime around 10,000 years ago, the site was deliberately buried. Not abandoned, buried. The enclosures were filled in with rubble and soil in what appears to have been an intentional act, covering the pillars and preserving them under meters of fill. This is why they survived so well. This is why, when Klaus Schmidt began excavating, he found structures that had been sealed for 10,000 years in nearly pristine condition. Why would you bury a monument? Why would you take the time and effort to fill in enclosures that had presumably served some important ritual or social function, covering them so completely that they would be invisible from the surface? One possibility is that the burial was a form of preservation, that the people who buried Göbekli Tepe understood that the site was at risk, perhaps from the social disruptions of the end of the Younger Dryas and the beginning of the Neolithic transition, and chose to seal it rather than allow it to be destroyed or desecrated, that the burial was not an ending but a form of protection, a way of ensuring that what had been built would survive whatever was coming. Another possibility is that the burial was itself a ritual act, a conscious interment of the old world's sacred center as part of a transition to something new, that the people who filled in the enclosures were not hiding the site from enemies but offering it back to the earth, completing a cycle, closing a chapter in a story that was moving into its next phase. In either case, the act speaks to a deliberate relationship with the past. These were people who thought carefully about what should be preserved and how. They were, in their own way, archivists. If that is what happened, it worked. For 10,000 years, the site slept beneath the hill, waiting to be found. What else might be sleeping beneath hills we have not yet thought to excavate? Let us move now to the water, because the most dramatic evidence of what happened at the end of the last ice age is not on land, but beneath the sea. When the ice age ended and the great glaciers melted, the water they released had to go somewhere. It went into the oceans. Sea levels that had been roughly 120 meters lower than today rose, over the course of several thousand years, to their current position. That 120-meter difference is not an abstraction. It is the difference between a world with significantly more land and the world we inhabit now. Entire continental shelves that were dry land during the Ice Age are now submerged. Coastlines that were inhabited by human communities are now beneath tens or hundreds of meters of ocean water. The Sunda Shelf, the submerged platform beneath the shallow seas of Southeast Asia, was once a landmass roughly the size of India, connecting what are now the islands of Indonesia to the Asian mainland. This land, sometimes called Sundaland by researchers, would have been one of the most productive environments on Earth during the Ice Age, a vast tropical lowland with rivers, forests, and coastlines stretching for thousands of kilometers. It was almost certainly inhabited. The human remains and artifacts that would tell us about its inhabitants are now beneath the Java Sea and the South China Sea, inaccessible to conventional archaeology. The Persian Gulf, today a body of water up to 90 meters deep, was during the last Ice Age a river valley. The Tigris and Euphrates, the rivers that would later give rise to Mesopotamian civilization, did not empty into the sea where they do now. They flowed through a fertile lowland, joined by rivers flowing from what is now the Arabian Peninsula, and reached the sea somewhere near the modern Strait of Hormuz. This valley, sometimes called the Persian Gulf Oasis by researchers who have studied its submerged topography, would have been one of the most habitable places on Earth during the Ice Age, sheltered from cold northern winds by the Zagros Mountains, watered by multiple rivers, rich in game and plant food. It was drowned rapidly by geological standards. The Persian Gulf flooded from its southern end as sea levels rose, the salt water advancing northward through the strait and inundating the valley over a period of perhaps a few thousand years, possibly less. The communities that lived there and the archaeological and genetic evidence strongly suggests that people did live there would have watched the sea advance during their lifetimes, retreating northward toward the rivers, toward the foothills of the Zagros, toward the land that would eventually become the cradle of Mesopotamian civilization. Is it possible that the memory of this flooding, the loss of a fertile homeland to rising waters, is what became the Mesopotamian flood myth? Is it possible that the story of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of Atrahasis, the story that would eventually be absorbed into the Hebrew tradition as the story of Noah, is a cultural memory of the actual drowning of an actual homeland? The Sumerian King List, a document that has survived on multiple clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia, records a list of kings who ruled before and after a great flood. The kings before the flood are listed with reigns of tens of thousands of years, numbers that have led many scholars to dismiss the entire document as mythological fantasy. But the kings after the flood have reigns that gradually decrease toward historically plausible lengths. The document treats the flood not as a myth, but as a historical event, a dividing line between one era and another, after which the world was different. The Sumerian scribes who recorded this were not naive. They were some of the most sophisticated administrators and record keepers the ancient world produced. They tracked the movements of Venus across the sky with a precision that modern astronomers did not match until the 20th century. They developed a mathematical system capable of calculating compound interest and solving quadratic equations. They maintained archives of commercial transactions, legal codes, and administrative records with a rigor that would be recognizable to any modern bureaucrat. These were not people who confused legend with fact in their record keeping, and yet they recorded the flood as fact. Perhaps the exaggerated reign lengths of the pre-flood kings are not evidence of mythological thinking, but of a different kind of encoding. Perhaps the enormous numbers are a way of saying that these kings belonged to a different era, an era so remote and so different from the present that its temporal scale could not be expressed in the same terms as the post-flood world. Perhaps the scribes were doing what the Aboriginal Australians were doing, encoding a genuine historical memory in the only format available to them, using the tools of their tradition to preserve information about a world that had been lost. The question of what was lost is the one that keeps pulling us deeper into the archive, because here is what the evidence, taken together, suggests. At the end of the last ice age, there were human communities living in places that are now underwater. These communities were not primitive. The evidence from Göbekli Tepe, and from the sophistication of Clovis technology, and from the precision of Aboriginal geographic memory, suggests that the people of the late Ice Age were capable of levels of social organization and knowledge accumulation that we have systematically underestimated. When the sea levels rose and the climate shifted and the great animals died and the world reorganized itself, those communities lost something, not just their homes, their accumulated knowledge, their archives, their understanding of the world as it had been. What survived was what could be carried: stories, memories, the things that a human voice could transmit to a child in the dark. And this is where the pattern becomes something more than historical curiosity. Because the pattern is not just about what happened 12,000 years ago. The pattern is about cycles, about the rhythm of catastrophe and renewal that runs through the deep history of our planet, about the question of whether we are, right now, at a particular moment in that rhythm. The geological record is not ambiguous on this point. The Earth has experienced repeated cycles of glaciation and warming over the past 2.5 million years, driven by variations in the planet's orbital geometry. The Milankovitch cycles, which alter the amount and distribution of solar energy received at different latitudes. These cycles operate on timescales of roughly 20,000, 40,000, and 100,000 years, producing a rhythm of ice ages and interglacials that has been running like a clock in the background of all human history. We are currently in an interglacial period called the Holocene, which began approximately 11,700 years ago with the end of the younger Dryas. The previous interglacial, called the Eemian, lasted roughly 15,000 years and ended with the onset of the last ice age. The Holocene is now approximately 11,700 years old. The mathematics here are not comfortable. Now, it would be dishonest to present this as a simple countdown. Climate science is not that straightforward, and the Milankovitch cycles do not operate like a timer that rings at a precise moment. The onset of glaciation depends on complex interactions between orbital forcing, greenhouse gas concentrations, ocean circulation, ice sheet dynamics, and feedback processes that are still being actively researched. Some researchers have argued that the current high concentrations of atmospheric carbon dioxide, the result of industrial activity over the past 2 centuries, may actually delay the next glaciation by thousands of years, essentially overriding the orbital signal with an anthropogenic one. But the question is not simply whether we are about to enter an ice age. The question is broader and more unsettling than that. The question is about the nature of stability, about how quickly the systems that support human civilization can reorganize, about what the geological record tells us about the relationship between a stable climate and the possibility of complex society. Consider this. Every major human civilization in the historical record, every civilization that has left written documents and monumental architecture and evidence of complex social organization, developed during the Holocene. Every single one, the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Indus Valley Civilization, the Chinese dynasties, the Mesoamerican cultures, the Greeks, the Romans, all of them arose during a period of remarkable climatic stability by geological standards. The Holocene has been, compared to what preceded it, unusually warm, unusually wet, and unusually consistent. The temperature swings that characterized the Pleistocene, the era of repeated glaciations, have been largely absent from the Holocene. The world that built civilization was a world that stayed still long enough for civilization to take root. What happens when it stops staying still? The historical record within the Holocene provides some answers, and they are sobering. The period between roughly 4,200 and 3,900 years ago, known to researchers as the 4.2 kilo-year event, was a period of severe drought that appears to have contributed to the collapse of several major civilizations simultaneously. The Akkadian Empire, one of the world's first empires, collapsed. The Old Kingdom of Egypt ended. The Indus Valley Civilization began its decline. The early Bronze Age cultures of the Aegean experienced disruption. A single climatic event, a shift in monsoon patterns and drought conditions affecting a wide swath of the Old World, appears to have stressed multiple complex societies to the point of collapse within roughly the same century. The Late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE is another example. Within a period of perhaps 50 years, the major palace civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, the Egyptians of the New Kingdom, the Ugaritic civilization of the Syrian coast, all experienced catastrophic disruption. Cities were burned and abandoned. Trade networks that had connected the Mediterranean world for centuries collapsed. Writing systems were lost. Population levels dropped dramatically. The causes are still debated, but they appear to include drought, systems collapse, migration, and possibly seismic activity operating simultaneously in a cascade of interconnected failures. The pattern that emerges from these historical examples is not one of civilizations destroyed by single dramatic catastrophes, though those happen too. It is one of civilizations that had grown complex enough to be brittle, that had built systems of supply and trade and social organization that worked beautifully under stable conditions but were vulnerable to disruption when multiple stresses occurred simultaneously. The more complex the system, the more connections it has, and the more ways it can fail when something goes wrong. This is the concept that complexity theorists call cascading failure. And it is a concept that anyone who has spent time thinking about the modern world will find uncomfortably familiar. We have built, over the past century, a civilization of extraordinary complexity. The supply chains that deliver food to cities, the energy systems that power them, the financial networks that coordinate economic activity, the communication infrastructure that allows information to flow, the agricultural systems that feed 8 billion people. All of these are deeply interconnected, globally distributed, and dependent on conditions of stability that we have largely taken for granted. The same interconnection that makes the system so productive also makes it vulnerable to cascading failure in ways that are difficult to predict and potentially very difficult to arrest once they begin. The ancient world knew this, even if it did not have the vocabulary of complexity theory to describe it. The stories that survived the great collapses, the flood myths and the tales of previous worlds, and the warnings encoded in oral tradition carry within them a consistent message. The world can end. The world has ended before. What survives is what you carry with you, what you remember, what you teach your children. The Hopi tradition speaks of the responsibilities of the current world's inhabitants, not just to maintain the ceremonies and the relationships with the land that keep the world in balance, but to remember what happened to the previous worlds, to hold the memory of collapse as a living thing, not an abstract historical fact, but a present reality that requires active attention. The tradition does not present the end of a world as inevitable. It presents it as a consequence of forgetting, a consequence of losing the relationships and the knowledge that make sustainable life possible. This is not naive mysticism. This is, in its own language, a systems analysis. The Hopi elders who maintained these traditions were observing, over generations, the relationship between human behavior and environmental health. They were encoding their observations in a form that could survive without writing, without institutions, without any of the infrastructure that we associate with the preservation of knowledge. And they were warning that the loss of that knowledge, the forgetting of the relationships that sustain life, is itself a form of catastrophe. What would it mean to take that warning seriously? And here I want to pause and ask you something directly. Are there other ancient traditions, other texts, or oral histories or monuments that you have encountered which seem to be encoding the same kind of warning? Something that struck you as too specific to be coincidence, too precise to be purely symbolic? Leave it in the comments. The archive grows richer every time someone adds what they have noticed. Let us return to the water one more time, because there is a detail in the scientific record that has not received the attention it deserves. The Younger Dryas began, most researchers now believe, as a result of a disruption to ocean circulation, specifically the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, the AMOT. The great conveyor belt of warm surface water that flows northward from the tropics and cold deep water that flows southward along the ocean floor. This circulation is driven by the density difference between warm, salty surface water and cold, dense, deep water. When the warm surface water reaches the North Atlantic, it releases its heat to the atmosphere, warming northwestern Europe and keeping it habitable at latitudes that would otherwise be far colder. The cooled water then sinks and flows southward along the ocean floor, completing the circuit. The hypothesis for the Younger Dryas onset is that the rapid melting of the Laurentide ice sheet released an enormous pulse of fresh water into the North Atlantic. Fresh water is less dense than salt water, A large influx of fresh water would have formed a low-density cap on the surface of the North Atlantic, preventing the warm, salty water from sinking, effectively shutting down or severely weakening the AMOK. Without the heat transport of the AMOK, the North Atlantic and the lands surrounding it cooled rapidly. The conveyor belt stopped. The warmth stopped flowing north. This mechanism is not hypothetical. It is supported by geological evidence, and it is a mechanism that climate scientists actively study today, because the AMOK is currently weakening. Multiple research groups, using different methods, have documented a slowdown in AMOK strength over the past century, with the most significant weakening occurring in recent decades. A 2021 study published in Nature Climate Change, analysing sea surface temperature patterns as a proxy for AMOK strength, concluded that the current circulation is at its weakest point in over a millennium. Other studies using direct measurements from ocean monitoring arrays have confirmed the weakening trend, though the precise rate and the question of whether a critical threshold is approaching remain subjects of active scientific debate. The source of the fresh water in this case is not a melting ice sheet in the traditional sense, but the accelerating loss of the Greenland ice sheet and Arctic sea ice, which are releasing fresh water into the North Atlantic at rates that were not anticipated by the models of even 20 years ago. The mechanism is the same as the one that may have triggered the younger Dryas. The scale is different, the speed is different, but the physics are the same. This is not a claim that we're on the verge of a younger Dryas scale cooling event. The scientific consensus is that human-driven warming will dominate the climate signal for the foreseeable future, and that the most likely consequence of AMOK weakening is not a return to Ice Age conditions, but a regional cooling of northwestern Europe superimposed on a globally warming background. With disruptions to rainfall patterns, sea level rise along the eastern coast of North America, and changes to the monsoon systems that water much of the world's agricultural land. But the deeper point is not about any specific prediction. The deeper point is about vulnerability, about the relationship between the stability of physical systems and the stability of the human systems built upon them, about the fact that the great civilizations of the past were not destroyed by the slow grinding of geological time, but by relatively rapid reorganizations of the climate system, that their infrastructure and social organization could not adapt to quickly enough. The people who lived through the younger Dryas did not know it was coming. They had no scientific models, no monitoring networks, no early warning systems. They had only the stories they had been told about previous disruptions, the accumulated wisdom of generations encoded in myth and ceremony, and the careful observation of the natural world. Some of that wisdom survived. Some of it was lost. What survived became the foundation of everything that came after. We have something they did not have. We have the record. We have the ice cores and the lake sediments and the ocean floor cores and the cave formations and the archaeological sites and the oral traditions and the written histories and the scientific instruments. We have, in the archive of the planet's own memory, a detailed account of how the world has changed before and how quickly it can change again. We have, in the cultural memories of peoples whose traditions stretch back to the events themselves, warnings encoded by survivors for the benefit of those who would come after. The question is, whether we are reading the archive carefully enough. There is a concept in information theory called the signal-to-noise ratio. The signal is the meaningful information. The noise is everything else, the random variation, the irrelevant data, the interference that makes it difficult to hear what the signal is actually saying. In a world saturated with information, where every moment generates more data than any previous era could have imagined, the challenge is not access to information. The challenge is attention. The challenge is knowing which signals to listen to and which to let pass. The Aboriginal Australians who preserved accurate geographic information for 10,000 years were not doing so by storing it in a database. They were doing so by maintaining a culture in which that information was considered sacred, in which the transmission of knowledge was treated as a serious responsibility, in which the stories that carried the information were embedded in ceremony and ritual, and the rhythms of daily life in ways that made forgetting difficult. The signal was kept clear by cultural practices designed specifically to protect it. The Sumerian scribes who recorded the flood on clay tablets were not doing so because they thought it was an interesting story. They were doing so because they believed the record mattered, because they understood that the memory of what had happened was a resource that future generations would need. The clay tablets were their archive, their insurance against the forgetting that follows catastrophe. What is our archive? What are we preserving? And for whom? And in what form? These are not rhetorical questions, they are practical ones. Because the pattern that runs through the deep history of human civilization is not simply a pattern of catastrophe and loss. It is a pattern of catastrophe, loss, and recovery. Every collapse in the record is followed by a rebuilding. Every flood is followed by people climbing out of the water and beginning again. The question that determines what the rebuilding looks like, what knowledge survives to inform it, what mistakes are avoided, what wisdom is carried forward, is the question of what was preserved. The oral traditions that have survived from the end of the last ice age are not just historical curiosities, they are demonstrations of what is possible. They are proof that human memory, properly maintained, can carry information across timescales that dwarf the entire span of recorded history. They are evidence that the capacity to preserve knowledge against catastrophe is not a modern invention. It is a very old skill, one that some cultures have maintained and others have allowed to atrophy. We are, in the archive of human knowledge, the inheritors of everything that was preserved. The writing systems, the mathematical traditions, the agricultural techniques, the navigational knowledge, the medical understanding, all of it was carried through the narrow passages of catastrophe by people who understood that the information was worth protecting. We are the beneficiaries of 10,000 years of careful transmission, and we are perhaps in a position that those transmitters could not have imagined. We have access to the entire archive. We can read the Sumerian flood myth and the Aboriginal coastal traditions and the Hopi cycle stories and the Norse Eddas and the Hindu Puranas and the ice core data and the ocean floor sediments and the cave formations all at once, all together, assembling a picture of the past that no previous generation could have assembled. We can see the pattern from a vantage point that the people who lived through the events could never have had. What the pattern shows is this: the world has ended before, in the sense that the conditions that supported a particular configuration of human civilization have changed, sometimes gradually, and sometimes with unsettling speed, and the civilizations built on those conditions have not always survived the change. What has survived is what was carried: the knowledge, the stories, the warnings, the memory of what was lost and how it was lost and what might have been done differently. The greatest civilizations in the record are not the ones that lasted the longest without disruption. They are the ones that built the most robust archives, the ones that found ways to encode their most important knowledge in forms that could survive the disruptions they knew from the record of the past were coming. The clay tablet is more durable than the palace. The story told to a child in the dark is more durable than the empire. This is perhaps the deepest lesson in the archive. Not that catastrophe is inevitable, though the record suggests that disruption is a permanent feature of life on a dynamic planet. Not that civilization is fragile, though the Bronze Age collapse and the fall of Rome and the drowning of Sunderland all demonstrate that complexity is not the same as permanence. The deepest lesson is about what endures, what carries meaning across the breaks, what the people on the other side of the flood will need. They will need to know what happened. They will need the record. They will need the archive. And here we are, in the quiet hours, in the dark, tending the archive together. There is something worth noticing about the timing of this conversation. Not the calendar date, not the specific year, but the broader moment. We are living in a period when the scientific tools to read the planet's own memory have reached a level of precision that would have seemed miraculous to researchers even 50 years ago. We can read the temperature of a summer in Greenland 12,000 years ago from the chemistry of a snowflake. We can identify the specific season when a stalactite in a Spanish cave stopped growing and started again. We can map the coastlines of drowned continents from the comfort of a research vessel floating above them. We can hear, in the oral traditions of cultures that have maintained their knowledge across 60,000 years, descriptions of landscapes that we can now verify against the geological record. We are, for the first time, in a position to read the full archive. Not just the written portion, not just the last 5,000 years of recorded history, but the deep archive, the one that goes back to the beginning of our species and beyond, the one encoded in ice and stone and ocean sediment, and the living memories of the oldest cultures on Earth. And what the full archive shows, read carefully and completely, is a picture of a species that has been through this before. Not this exact configuration, not this specific moment, but this type of moment. A moment of transition, a moment when the systems that have supported a particular way of living are under stress. A moment when the question of what to preserve and how to preserve it is not an academic exercise, but a practical urgency. The Aboriginal Australians who remembered the coastlines did not know they were doing something remarkable. They were simply doing what their tradition required, telling the stories, maintaining the ceremonies, passing the knowledge to the children, keeping the archive alive. The Sumerian scribes who recorded the flood did not know that their clay tablets would be read 5,000 years later by researchers trying to understand the deep history of climate change. They were doing their job, maintaining the record, trusting that the record mattered, even when they could not know who would eventually read it. We are in the archive now, the night shift, The hours when the noise of the day has quieted enough to hear the older signals. The hours when the distance between the present and the deep past becomes, somehow, smaller. When the questions that the ancient world encoded in its stories feel less like history and more like conversation. What does it mean that the world has ended before? What does it mean that the people who lived through those endings found ways to preserve what mattered? What does it mean that the memory has survived, encoded in ice and stone, and the living voices of cultures that refuse to forget? Maybe it means that the archive is more resilient than the civilizations it outlasts. Maybe it means that the knowledge of how to survive, how to rebuild, how to carry what matters through the narrow passages of catastrophe is itself one of the oldest and most carefully preserved pieces of human knowledge. Maybe the flood myths are not warnings about what is coming. Maybe they are reassurances about what is possible. We have been through this before. We carried the memory through. We built again. The clay remembers what we have forgotten. The ice remembers. The stone remembers. The stories that have been told in the dark for 60,000 years remember. And somewhere in that accumulated memory, in the full archive of everything the planet and its oldest cultures have preserved, is the knowledge we need. The question is whether we are listening carefully enough to hear it. Let the question rest now. Let it settle into the quiet alongside everything else the night holds. The archive does not demand immediate answers. It asks only for attention, for the willingness to listen, for the patience to sit with what is not yet resolved, and trust that the sitting itself is part of the work. The oldest stories on Earth are still being told. In the desert communities of Australia, in the academic papers of climate scientists, in the careful translations of Sumerian tablets, in the ongoing excavations at sites that are still yielding their secrets to those patient enough to look. The archive is not closed. It is not finished. It is in fact growing as we add our own layer to the record, our own contribution to the memory that will outlast us and be read, perhaps by someone who needs it in a future we cannot fully imagine. The memory has learned to survive every flood, every collapse, every forgetting. It will survive this one too. And as the quiet of the night settles more deeply around you, as the questions drift and the evidence rests in the comfortable darkness of the mind that is beginning to release its hold on the day, perhaps that is the most important thing the archive has to offer. Not alarm, not urgency, not the cold splash of a warning delivered too late, but the warm, steady knowledge that we are not the first to stand at this kind of threshold, that others have stood here before us and found their way through, that the knowledge of how to do that is preserved in the ice and the stone and the clay and the stories told in the dark, waiting for those who are patient enough to look. If there is someone in your life who carries this kind of quiet curiosity, who lies awake, turning over the deep questions, consider passing this along to them. The act of sharing something like this is itself a small form of archiving, connecting one seeker to another across whatever distance separates you, adding one more thread to the network of people who think it matters to remember. And if a sleepless night finds you again, this one rewards a second listen. The layers tend to reveal themselves differently in the podcast. The night shift continues. The archive breathes. Somewhere beneath the ocean, the old coastlines rest in the dark, remembering the people who walked them. Somewhere in the ice, the memory of a summer 12,000 years ago is held in perfect stillness, waiting for the instrument that can read it. Somewhere in the dark, a voice is telling a child a story that will still be told 10,000 years from now, carrying a memory forward through time with a care and a faithfulness that no institution, no empire, no civilization has ever quite matched. That is what we are, keepers of the archive, tellers of the old stories in the new dark. Rest now. The archive will be here when you wake. The same instinct that drives this question, what is being hidden and why, runs beneath the Sphinx as well. The video on this channel exploring what lies beneath that monument and why access to it remains so tightly controlled carries the same quiet urgency. The sense that the answers are there, sealed beneath stone, waiting for those willing to look.